Hey folks, this is Mark Ludwig from the Allegan Conservation District, running through our presentation on balancing agricultural production with grassland bird nesting success, better known as the Flushing Bar Project. We put this together to highlight the Flushing Bar Project. We had a project a few years ago where we had to do something for grassland birds and actually set upon promoting flushing bars as the most important thing as the most effective way to do it, and I'll kind of run through why I think the flushing bar is a very effective thing we can promote to our farmers, and why some of the other things that we promote as conservation professionals are not always as effective as we wanted to be. I'll start out with just a quick sketch of the problem, and I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this. A lot of our natural grasslands have basically disappeared, and Michigan's, where we're located, is no exception. If you look at the map back in before settlement, or before European settlement, we had considerable grasslands to the south of the state, not too much to the north, really only places where we had the pine barrens that were where the soil was so lousy they couldn't support trees did we really get open grasslands. Contrast this with post-European settlement. We got to Michigan, cut down most of the trees, and we really spread grasslands throughout the state to support kind of our subsistence level agriculture that we were practicing at the time. We needed grasslands to feed the family cow, feed the horses and things that we used for transportation. So grasslands were very important and well distributed around the state. And really this is kind of the height of grassland birds and grassland wildlife in Michigan, just because there was such good distribution of these grasslands. In our modern situation, of course, most of our original grasslands are gone. We have some small fragments of them. We do have a fairly strong restoration movement that's getting some of those restored grasslands out on the landscape, but we do see a lot of trouble with these grasslands, certainly. What are we talking about as a grassland? Certainly a short grass prairie on our poorer soils in the east, or out west where we just don't have the water to support tall grass prairie. We also have tall grass prairie, a little denser, a little taller, certainly more attractive to certain birds. And of course wet prairie, where we're often transitioning into wetlands, marshes, or actual open water. And some of our ducks and things are more attracted to this and move out into our grasslands for breeding purposes. Unfortunately, our crop fields really mimic natural grasslands pretty effectively. Often they're the largest areas clear of woody plants in an area, often nice big square fields, so it's very attractive to a lot of our grassland nesting wildlife. Pastures, in a lot of ways, are ideal grasslands because not only are they, of course, full of grass, well managed to keep brush down, but the manure on these sites produces a lot of insects for the birds to go after. So it's in many ways kind of the ideal agricultural grassland for grassland nesting species. Grassland birds have really taken a whooping in the last 30-40 years. We've seen tremendous declines in certain species, really, besides our bird life in Hawaii and Guam and some other exceptional cases. They have been the hardest hit of our bird species. Habitat fragmentation is certainly part of that. Some of these birds really crave much larger blocks of land than we typically see in these small restored grasslands. In a lot of ways, bigger is better, squarer is better, where we don't have strips where we have more predator problems. So there's a lot to be said for bigger restorations when we do it. Predation often gets pointed to. I guess I have my doubts whether or not predation has been decisive. These animals have certainly been preyed upon by our different predators for millennia. That really hasn't changed. What's really changed is the habitat availability. What we're really trying to avoid when we start talking about grassland bird preservation is not so much the predation of the chicks, although that's important, of course, but the loss of adult breeding animals. When we have an ecological sink where a habitat looks good to these animals but turns out to be deadly not only to offspring but also breeding adults, that's when we're really in trouble. Um, I'm going to switch to talking about farmers now, and when I talk about farmers, I don't want people to think I'm painting with a real broad brush. A lot of different attitudes out there in the countryside. Some of our farmers are avid hunters, avid birders, real conservationists at heart, and we've certainly had good cooperators when we went out there looking for them. Uh, so take what I say as general, but not necessarily good for any specific farmer. So what's changed down on the farm that we might use to explain what's going on with our grassland birds? First of all, hay production has declined quite sharply, and I'll show you some statistics on that as we go along. We can not only blame the loss of horses on the farm, but also high corn silage rations. That has just been huge in cattle production. We have a lot fewer pastures than we used to have because of confinement to agriculture. Um, and we've gone from a situation where we might be feeding 10 or 20% corn silage in a ration to all the way up to 80-90% corn silage, and that's been huge. It's really gotten rid of a lot of hay. We're also cutting what hay is left more often, and we're cutting it with faster machines. So we may be cutting 3, 4, even 5 times a year, and we're cutting with a disc mower that may move up to 3 times faster than the old sickle bar mowers. And we're cutting with wider equipment. When you're cutting 45, 50 feet of hay at a go, that's a lot of room for a young bird to run to get out of the way. Here's an example of the change we've seen in hay production. We kind of start off as the state is being settled in the middle 1800s at around 1 million acres of hay. That peaks in the 20s when we're kind of at the peak of the smallholder farms, still using a lot of horses on the farm, not very many tractors yet. But as you see, by after World War II, we start to decline, and 30 years after World War II, we've lost half of the hay. And in 1978, that's about the point when the high corn silage ration really starts taking off, dairy consolidation's taking off, and these guys are starting to, for a number of reasons, switch to more corn silage-based diet. Last date you see there, 2007, we're back to about that 1 million acres of hay. Would not surprise me to see us well under that. 2007 is about the point of, where corn really takes off in price, and I know a lot of hay and pasture land got converted into row crops at that point. So what can we do to return balance? What can we do that is going to be accepted by our farmers rather than just a pie in the sky solutions? Well, let's start off by talking about what's not going to be so very popular down on the farm. One thing we as conservationists really harp on is let's just cut that hay later. Let's have a nice big window for these birds to breed. And I'm not saying don't ask for that one down on the farm, but I am going to say that you've got some serious problems with that, and let's see why. Most of your farmers want to cut hay right about in here, and here's why. Cellulose is going up. That's okay. Even if that cellulose is climbing a little higher, that's something that, as long as there's enough energy in the diet, the critters can use. However, here's the energy. Non-structural carbohydrates like sugars and pectins. These decline rapidly as we start flowering and really drop off considerably. Protein follows shortly thereafter. It's dropping sharply. And lignin is climbing. Lignin is almost completely indigestible and actually makes the hay kind of unpalatable to our critters. So basically, by asking our farmers to cut later, we are asking them to, instead of making feed, make bedding. And especially in a context where we just don't have a whole lot of hay being made, what hay is left on the farm, especially in the dairy context, has to be of very high quality in order to be of value to the farmer. That circle you see where it says optimum first cut, that is where the forage yield curve and the quality curve cross. As you can see, quality starts off very high when we're getting low yield, and when it kind of crosses here where yield and quality cross, that's kind of at that bud stage. That's where we really want to see it. we get a little offsetting love just because the yield goes up so high, but as you can see, the stem yield and the leaf yield move in unfavorable directions, and forage digestibility just plunges. So it's a pretty hard sell telling people to cut late. This balance is also hard for other reasons beyond just the quality of the hay. Many farms do not have sufficient manure storage to go all summer with and be able to store all their manure. They really rely on these hay fields between cuttings of hay as a place to target manure application. The guy kind of down in the middle there, he's a dairy nutritionist. He wants hay of uniform quality, 24/7, 365 in front of those cows. The more uniform you can keep that diet, the easier it is to keep your cows healthy. It's very important to the dairy farm especially. And I think there's some social pressure too. You know, if that hay is getting tall and woody and nasty looking, you're going to hear about it down at the cafe. So definitely a hard sell. And here's one of the reasons why, you know, our Holstein model from 1900, you know, a good one was making 10, 12,000 pounds of milk a year. A Holstein today can easily make 30, 40, 50, 60,000 pounds of milk a year. At these kind of production levels, it gets very easy to make a disaster down on the farm if you start feeding bad hay and bad feed. It's real easy to do. So what can we do? We do talk a lot about planting warm season grass down on the farm. This is something we undertook as part of our grant project, and we got a few fellas to bite. You know, I've got to say, it has not proven to be very popular. You know, I've gotten a lot of guys calling, asking, you know, is that stuff really there? I've had to go out and look at some fields and confirm for fellas, yes, it's still growing. It'll be up. You'll be able to cut it in a year or so. That's a tough sell. Certainly, legumes have a little flatter quality peaks and valleys as compared to our grass crops. So legumes like alfalfa are a little more forgiving. That only carries you so far. It still does begin to decline in quality as it flowers. One thing we can do, though, is encourage late maturing varieties of any given species, and this graph kind of demonstrates that. These are a couple of our more common farm grasses, and you can see the spread from the earliest to latest maturing varieties. It can be as much as 2 weeks, 3 weeks, even a whole month. So if we can just pick the latest maturing variety of a given species of forage, that can be quite helpful in keeping that forage out there a little longer. Here's a really easy one, and this is one I'd encourage you to hit every time you're out on the farm. Just change the way you mow a field. Our typically the way we were taught to do this as kids, you get out here in your hay field, you go around the outside one way, and then you swing around and come back, and you just cut round and round and round and round. Well, by the time you get here, you've got the last of the critters all driven into the middle of that hay, and that last pass or two, that gets pretty hard on whoever's left over and still alive. If we can mow instead across the field this way, and therefore driving the animals out of the field on our last pass, or if we can mow the long way inside and out, or kind of spiral out from the middle, that way we're at least driving the animals out of the field instead of driving them into peril at the middle of the field. My favorite solution, obviously, is to think about adding a flushing bar to your rig. And it doesn't have to be anything complicated. You see on the left there's one made out of wood, a couple of chains. Boy, that must have taken at least a couple hours there in the shop, even if you were drinking beer. So I don't want, as I show you some of the designs we came up with, I don't want you to think it has to be overly complicated. On the right there, we can see one that's a little more complicated. It's got some breakaways to it, so it's if you collide with something out there in the field, it'll get out of your way. So certainly a good solution to my mind. A couple of things I've heard as I talk to people. Why don't you just broadcast noise? Well, number one, if you know anything about hay mowing equipment, it's pretty darn noisy to begin with. Some of it's really very loud. I think if noise was going to be scary enough to these animals, we wouldn't even have to talk about flushing bars, because the noise of the equipment would be doing it. I've also heard people say, well, why don't you blast air out in front of it? And again, not really sure that's going to be terribly effective, and technically I have a hard time imagining a system where you could put enough air out there to really scare those birds up and out of the way. Especially out west, got an awful lot of wind to begin with. I'm not sure a little more wind is going to be enough to get critters up and moving. However, there's something about that touch of the chain actually running through the field. I think it really kind of simulates a predator attack to the animals. It's also making a metallic jangling noise as it's coming in there. I think that certainly can't hurt, and some guys swear by hanging sleigh bells on the ends of these things as well to make some extra noise. Flushing bars came along pretty darn early in the history of mechanical mowing. I've seen accounts basically of as soon as the mechanical mower came along, we started killing birds in fields, and people started adding some chains up front to try and scare things out of the way. This is a Works Project Administration poster from the 30s encouraging folks to use a flushing bar, and as you can see, it's hung off the horse collar or off the tongue of a horse-drawn piece of equipment. So they have been around for a while. This is actually a picture somebody pointed out to me online of an old Ford Ferguson tractor. Not sure if this is homemade or factory made, but again, we certainly have seen these around for a goodly long time and seen people using them. This was kind of where we started when we launched the Flushing Bar project. This is a Ducks Unlimited design that they came up with up in Canada. I liked that the bar could be stood up for going down the road. I liked that you could fold it in half so it wasn't tall enough to contact the high voltage wires on the farm and all that. What I didn't like was this right here. We've got this attachment point where the tremendous leverage from, for example, contacting something out here, I think would break that point in a heartbeat, and then you've just got a broken piece of junk hanging off the front of your tractor, which nobody wants. So I did go ahead and modify this design a little bit when we started building bars for our participating farmers in 2012. So here's what we did. We started with a quick attach plate, which could be snapped onto a front end loader. We liked that because it made it quick and easy to take it on and off, allowed the farmer to be able to lift and lower the bar as we went along. And we added a pivot to the system right here. Here's the original pivot that they had, but right here we added what's called a heim joint. You may know it as the ball joint on your 3-point hitch. That way, if we did have a collision out there on the end of that bar could actually swing, and it also could pivot a little this way because of the ball joint nature. We did have to go ahead then and add a spreader to the mast so we could put 2 chains on it instead of just the one in order to kind of keep that bar centered. We also added these centering springs here. We'll show you that on the actual picture. That's just an effort to try to keep the bar centered because it was able, since the bar can actually swing and move around, might be a little more prone to being a problem. And this is a little hard to see, but this is one of the actual version 2.0 bars that we built. We kind of beefed up a few things. We do have a counter tension spring right here. This actually pulls back on the mast a little bit because, like I said, there is a tremendous amount of force from this bar hanging out here. Just the weight of the bar itself puts a lot of force on it. It's a little hard to tell, but these are 2 chains here coming up to a spreader that's about 3.5 feet wide, and then down here we've got that heim joint assembly. The other thing we did was we backed this way a little bit so that if this bar was ever to swing, it would hit on here before it ever got back to the operator, just to increase the safety of the situation. And then we've got these 2 springs here that kind of pull back and keep this thing centered. You will find plans and a materials list for this type of bar online at the flushingbarproject.net. I'll show you a screenshot of that in a minute. We did contemplate how to put a bar on a self-propelled mower. One of the things we thought about was potentially building a frame of fiberglass just for durability and lightness, and setting that up so it could actually be raised up when raised up and down when the mower is going through the field. We did a lot of speculating about this. We could not find anybody willing to give it a whirl. I do think, frankly, in order to crack how to hang a bar off some of these, we're going to need some help from the original equipment manufacturers. There just is a lot going on these machines. They're moving very rapidly, and with the bar being so close to the machine, you'd hate to have some kind of a failure on there. So we've certainly been harassing different original equipment manufacturers, and we got a little bit of action on that. I honestly think instead of fiberglass, we might even want to think about multi-stage hydraulic cylinders like the kind you see on forklift masts, so you could pull that flushing bar in when you needed a little more clearance and then shove it well out in front of the deck of the mower when you didn't need that clearance. So kind of a work in progress, certainly something I'm thinking about quite a bit. Here's some of the other configurations we're up against. On the left is a Kloss Cougar, one of the biggest hay mowers in the world. 5 decks, all independently controlled, and capable of going about 15 miles an hour through a hayfield, which is awfully darn fast. On the right, you see a John Deere set up on what we call a butterfly configuration, with 1 deck being pushed in front of the tractor and 2 decks to the rear. You certainly could think about potentially flushing off the front deck for the 2 rear ones. How that would help the birds being potentially impacted by the front deck is a mystery, but again, there's certainly some good thought that needs to go into this, and I really think you're going to need some engineers to figure this one out. This is our Flushing Bar Project website. It is currently an independent website. I'm not sure how much longer we're going to be able to leave that thing up unless we can find some sponsors for it. But right here, right on the front page, there's the construction tips for that Allegan type flushing bar. I'd certainly encourage people to go ahead and get that PDF down and spread it around the landscape. I'd hate to see this information disappear if we've got to take the website down. Gotten a little bit of love from Whitetails Unlimited. They agreed to put it up for a year. Certainly wouldn't mind seeing if there's any other NGOs out there who'd like to take this project on. I would be happy to hand it off because I don't have any money to run it anymore. A couple other thoughts about things we might be able to talk to our farmers about. I certainly encourage people to become familiar with management intensive grazing and to promote it anytime you can. I have been talking endlessly about the advantages of this kind of grass farming with farmers. Got to tell you, it hasn't been all that well received. A lot of our farmers have moved to big confinement operations. They've got a lot of money tied up in these big farms, and they have a hard time believing that kicking their cows out of their $1 million barn is a good idea after they put up with all the different hassles of building that thing. However, I think there's still a pretty good case to be made for this. There's a lot of data out there about the profitability of grass-based dairy farms as compared to our conventional farms, and it's pretty compelling. It definitely makes a big difference in the amount of money you're able to hang on to if the cows are doing their own feeding themselves and hauling out their own manure. A lot of times you get pushback from farmers saying, well, that might be okay for my neighbor down the road who's got 20 jerseys in a little stall barn. Not necessarily true. I certainly have seen some very large dairy farms primarily utilizing management-intensive grazing. Bickford's over in Wisconsin do quite a bit. They have about a 700 cow dairy, and they're crossing under a highway to access pastures. Mark and Charlie Opitz, also in Wisconsin, have about 2,000 cows. They actually built a second parlor on the far end of their farm so they could milk at either of those parlors and cover more ground. Klessing's in eastern Wisconsin, also about 500 cows, and they're utilizing a creamery on the farm to add value to the milk that they have and sell it directly. And certainly there are some nutritional advantages to pasture-based dairy that a farm could highlight. Here in Michigan, our Kellogg Biological Station dairy has gone to an all-pasture feeding program, and also has robotic milking. So that one's kind of a nifty one to go visit if you're ever in the greater Kalamazoo area. What about the birds? I think it's inarguable that grazing is less damaging than haying. I mean, the cattle move a lot slower, and I have personally seen 1,400 pounds of hay of Holstein fleeing angry bobolinks before, which is pretty impressive given that the bobolinks, maybe an ounce and a half on a good day when they're wet. So I do think that some of these birds will defend their nests, and I think it works well. And certainly anecdotally, we've seen tremendous grassland bird populations on some of these rotational grazing farms. However, we can try to encourage our farmers to defer grazing in areas where we know we have a lot of nestlings. Certainly, if there is a refuge area on that farm where we could encourage those birds to re-nest to, if they should be displaced. And I would say we could probably graze earlier than we could hay a field. Young birds that would have no chance of fleeing a great big mower have a much better chance of getting up and running for it from Holsteins, I would say, than they would from big mowers. Certainly, if we can get guys to look for areas that don't have tree and shrub cover, and just acquaint them with these different notions of what makes good grassland bird habitat, we may be able to actually improve the habitat on our grass-based farms. Excuse me, and just do a better job of encouraging the bird friendliness, I guess, of these different ones would be a good way to put it. So anyway, just to kind of wrap this thing up, I believe the flushing bar remains very effective for trail mowers, including disc mowers. We did have a participant in our group of 5 that did have a disc mower. He was quite enthusiastic about the usefulness of it, even though he was mowing at a pretty good clip. He did believe that the flushing bar was quite effective. Does appear to flush both game birds and deer. We had good luck flushing pheasants and some of the bigger birds. It was a little hard to get my guys used to looking for some of the little birds. They're a little harder to see, but certainly our bigger birds, turkeys, pheasants, and the deer are big enough that the operators notice them. I think a good operator, as usual, makes a difference. Sometimes you are going to have to step on that clutch and give them a few minutes to get out of the way once you see them. And I got to tell you, I did run into some farmers who flat out were uninterested because they do not mind mowing up deer or groundhogs. These are not popular animals on many farms unless you're a big hunter. So the idea of preserving deer might be one you want to reserve talking about. Start with the birds instead. And the big challenge right now is the shift in the technology down on the farm. Many of our bigger farms are going to these newer technologies, whether they're front-mounted butterfly type mounting or something like these Kloss Cougars. It is going to take participation of the original equipment manufacturers in order to solve this problem, in my humble opinion. These things are going to have to be integrated into the mowing system themselves. To really be effective. One thing I guess that is kind of a positive on the conservation side, now that the lesser prairie chicken has been listed, I think we've got a more compelling story to take to the OEMs. This is not just, we're going to save some pheasants so guys can go hunt them in South Dakota. We're talking about saving a whole hay industry in that lesser prairie chicken area. Because if we can't solve this problem of killing these birds in hayfields, presumably we're not going to want to have hayfields. So I do think this is a good time to start talking to these OEMs again, and I'd certainly encourage people to be doing that and talking about this new story we've got to deal with. What is this thing doing? There we go. Anyway, you see the website address down there. I will certainly do my very best to keep that thing up and running for as long as possible. If anybody's got any help for me on that one, I'd certainly appreciate it. That is my private cell number on there. Actually, that's not my private cell number. You can reach me at 616-240-7135. That's 616-240-7135. I'd be happy to talk about what we've learned about flushing bars over the last couple of years. And if somebody's got money for mileage, I'll saddle up and go out there and give this talk just about anywhere. Anyway, I encourage you to take a look at this old technology that's new again and think about that for your farmers. Thanks.